Fox News alert. Let's go out to Colorado now. Colorado movie massacre trial now moving on to phase 3. This is happening right now. Let's listen in to the judge.
Proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing. The answer is yes, and all of the jurors have signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 7, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Matthew McQuinn. Does the jury unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating factors that exist do not outweigh the aggravating factors proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing? The answer is yes, and all of the jurors have signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 8, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Michaela Medic. Does the jury unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating factors that exist do not outweigh the aggravating factors proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing? The answer, yes, and all of the jurors have signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 9, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Veronica Mosher Sullivan. Does the jury unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating factors that exist do not outweigh the aggravating factors proven by the prosecution in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing? The answer is yes, and all of the jurors signed section 1 of the verdict form. Phase 2 sentencing verdict form, count 10, murder in the first degree after deliberation, Alex Sullivan. Does the jury unanimously find...
All right, we are listening to the judge in Centennial, Colorado right now, reading through every victim in the Colorado movie theater massacre and saying that the jury has decided unanimously to move forward to phase 3, ultimately and potentially to the death penalty phase for James Holmes. Let's go back out to Dan Springer, who's live for us in Colorado. Also joining me, Brian Claypool, defense attorney, to get reaction. Dan, I guess it's surprising in a way, right, because this had to be unanimous, and Colorado is really not known as a death penalty state.
Well, that's right. There are only 3 people currently on death row in Colorado. That's because of this sort of convoluted death penalty law that demands that the jury come back 3 separate times with unanimous verdicts. Now they have come back twice, and this is an emphatic resolution here because they came back in just over 2.5 hours. They deliberated about an hour last Thursday and then a little over an hour today, and they came back and they said that the mitigating circumstances, the mental illness, the schizophrenia that James Holmes suffered from did not outweigh the heinous nature of this crime and all the planning that went into it. And many people who have been following this from day one thought this was Holmes's best chance to get away from the murder, from death penalty, because they thought that, you know what, a lot of people don't want to put to death a mentally ill person, and clearly everybody agreed that James Holmes had suffered from mental illness back 3 years ago when he went into that movie theater and shot it up and killed 12 people and injured 70 others. Nobody disputes that he had a mental illness. The question was, did it outweigh all the terrible results of what he did? 12 people dead, 70 injured, and lives destroyed forever.
All right.
And they came back and said no. Yeah,
Dan, stand by if you will. I want to go now to Brian Claypool to get a legal opinion on this. So, Brian, it really does come down to, I guess now when they go to phase 3, they're going to hear from the victims' families, and it's going to be a question and answer type of situation rather than victim statement and testimony. So it's going to come down to this question for jurors: do we execute people who are mentally ill, right?
Well, yes, Gretchen, but I've got to tell you, the fact that the jury deliberated only 2.5 hours and found that the mitigating factors did not outweigh the aggravating factors beyond a reasonable doubt, this does not bode well for James Holmes in phase 3. I agree with Dan. His best chance at getting off on the death penalty was in phase 2. He is likely to be executed to death. But then you're going to have another issue that's going to arise, Gretchen. If the jury comes back in phase 3 and says, yes, we are for sure sentencing you to death, you're going to have an issue raised by Holmes's lawyers as to whether it's constitutional to sentence to death James Holmes. You might have to have another mental exam, for example, to determine what his IQ is, to make that determination as to whether he can, in fact, be executed, because the jury's already found that he has a mental illness.
Well, Dan, I mean, how is that all going to factor in? Because we heard through his family testimony from his sister and his parents in phase 2 that he was an incredibly bright kid before mental illness took over. I mean, he was a straight A student who some people called a protege with regard to math.
Straight A student, had a very idyllic childhood. Everybody said he was a normal, albeit a shy kid, a very bright neurosurgeon, or, you know, he was going to get his PhD at Colorado. No, this was not a kid who was abused as a kid. He was not tortured as a young boy. The question of his mental stability, two of the experts said that he was mentally ill and could not decipher between right and wrong, and 2 of the experts said that he was mentally ill but could decipher between right and wrong. One of the questions is, in Colorado, the governor recently came out and said that while he's in office, there will be no executions on his watch. So another factor is, can there be governor nullification of the death penalty? We'll have to wait and see, but again, only 3 people currently on death row in this state.
Yeah, and Brian, politics always factors into anything when we're talking about the death penalty, but that's not going to factor into what the jurors are going to decide when they go now to phase 3. So how do you see this playing out? I explained earlier that they heard from the family of James Holmes in phase 2 to try and present these mitigating factors that they hoped would outweigh what the prosecution was saying. Now we're going to hear from the victims. How is that going to play out, Brian?
Well, it's not going to help James Holmes, because you're going to hear from the victims. You're going to hear the how terrible this is in their life, how they've lost loved ones, and this can only bring worse things for James Holmes. I don't see, Gretchen, how phase 3 can really help James Holmes at all. I think the arguments that had to have been made feverishly were that in James Holmes' diary, Gretchen, he actually wrote the word, I think, at least 50 times, the word why. He kept saying why in his diary. And he even said in there, you know, I have a broken mind. So I have to admit, I'm a little surprised by this verdict, because when Holmes is saying why, he's basically reaching out and saying, okay, wait a minute, I know I'm planning this thing, but somebody help me, because I don't really know why, and I don't really want to do this.
Right.
So his lawyers really have to try to weave in something like that in phase 3.
Well, help me understand from a legal point of view, mitigation and aggravation. So here's one thing that I read. When does mitigation outweigh aggravation? When the mitigation is the cause of the aggravation. So in this case, I guess mental illness caused him, obviously, to shoot in the theater. But the jury is disagreeing with that today and saying that the mitigating factors did not outweigh the aggravating ones, correct?
Right. You hit the nail on the head, Gretchen, and that's why I'm a little bit surprised. Because if I'm sitting in that jury box and I'm hearing all the experts, Gretchen, let's set the record straight. All of the experts in the case have said that James Holmes has a mental illness.
Yeah, but
that's
whether
powerful.
Or not he knew right from wrong, though. See, that's the difference. That's what Dan Springer was just saying, that it was 2 and 2.
No, I understand that, but it was, my point is this: it was 4-0 that he had a mental illness. It's very unprecedented across the country when a defendant is found to have a mental illness that he is sentenced to death. That's all I'm saying. I agree that it's 2-2 on whether he knew right from wrong, but still you have 2 experts saying he didn't know right from wrong, and then you've got his diary. To me, the most powerful evidence in the case was him writing those words, why? To me, this was a guy reaching out for help. I'm not excusing what he did, but that's why I'm a little bit surprised by this verdict.
All right, Dan, let me just bring you in. The judge is on count 24 right now, and he's obviously going down and saying with the jury unanimously on all of these counts. Tell us what's going to happen now. What's the timing for phase 3?
Well, we think that phase 3 will begin as early as tomorrow, and what will happen is we will start to have relatives, loved ones of the 12 people who were murdered by Holmes 3 years ago taking the stand. And unlike in most penalty phases where we see people get up and read statements, I understand that this will actually be questions and answers. So the prosecuting attorney will ask questions of these relatives of the victims about how this crime has impacted their lives. I expect it to be extremely emotional. As you just heard, I don't expect anything to come out of this to help James Holmes at all. I think, like I said, his best chance of avoiding the death penalty was in Phase 2.
Okay.
It would seem to be totally inconsistent if they came back in Phase 2 and said he's eligible, but then in Phase 3 said no, life in prison. All
right, guys, stand by. I want to go back live into the courtroom. The judge is now polling the jurors. Let's listen in.
Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts? Seat number 2, Juror 17. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts?
Yes, Your Honor.
Seat number 3, Juror 329. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts?
Yes, sir.
Seat number 5, Juror 535. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts?
Yes.
Seat number 6, Juror 87. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts? Seat number 11, Juror 118. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jurors' Phase 2 sentencing verdicts?
Yes, sir.
Seat number 13, Juror 378. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts?
Yes.
Seat number 14, Juror 155. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts?
Yes, sir.
Seat number 15, Juror 527. Are these your Phase 2 sentencing verdicts and the jury's Phase 2 sentencing verdicts?
Yes, sir.
Seat number 17, but temporarily sitting in seat number...
All right, you can hear the judge in Colorado going through each juror, asking them if, in fact, this is their verdict. They have gone through 24 counts. They have said that they unanimously want to move the James Holmes trial onto Phase 3, the death penalty phase officially. Dan and Brian are still with me. So, Dan, I guess that the lawyers had to be ready for this, obviously, because now they have to have witnesses that are available tomorrow to come, right?
Right, and that's a question I have. I don't know if they can get all of the people who will be on the stand testifying as victims in this case tomorrow. So it might be a delay of another day. I just don't know. I know it won't continue today, but I've heard that it could happen as early as tomorrow. But there are 15 people who are on the list to be on the stand as victims. So we could have a full day tomorrow. We could even go into another day of people talking about how these heinous crimes, how this horrible shooting at this mall, at this theater impacted their lives. And I imagine it'd be very emotional as the lawyer tries to draw the emotions out of them to tell their stories about how this has impacted their lives.
All right, and the judge is just now releasing the jurors. So, Brian, as we wrap up what's happened here today, once again, it's a complicated system in Colorado. Phase 1, they found James Holmes guilty of these 12 murders. Then they moved to Phase 2, and that was whether or not the mitigating factors outweighed the aggravating ones. In other words, will he go on to possibly face the death penalty? Today, what we're seeing is the jurors unanimously say yes. So now, Brian, we move on to this Phase 3. Complicated system in Colorado, right?
It's complicated, Gretchen, but it's in place to make sure the jury gets the decision right. And as you noted earlier, Colorado is a very liberal state. That's why they have a 3-phase process. But I want to reiterate that James Holmes will be sentenced to death because the real death penalty phase of this case was Phase 2. His best shot at getting out was Phase 2. These victim impact statements will do nothing but hurt him more tomorrow or the following day.
All right, Dan Springer, Brian Claypool, great to have you both on board as this has been happening live right here on The Real Story. Thanks much.